I want to walk in liberty and freedom. If that is in your heart, the Bible said you ask for the Holy Ghost, and the Holy Ghost will come down, and He has all the power and all the provision you need to obey God. He has every right to demand it because He made provision to do it.
Just hours before David Wilkerson died in a tragic car crash, he published one final message. At the time, many saw it as a simple warning. But after his death, those words began to feel disturbingly different. Decades earlier, in 1973, Wilkerson had already described a future America filled with moral collapse, disaster, fear, and spiritual confusion. Back then, critics called him unstable. Some called him a false prophet. But today, millions are looking back at his words and asking the same chilling question. Was he truly wrong, or did he see something coming long before the rest of the world did? To understand why his final message still haunts people, we must go back to the moment David Wilkerson first began warning America about the future. The 14-year-old preacher, David Ray Wilkerson, was born on May 19, 1931, in Hammond, Indiana. In his family, ministry was not a choice. It was an inheritance. His grandfather and father were both Assemblies of God ministers, making David the third generation expected to follow the same path. He grew up in Turtle Creek, Pennsylvania, in a home remembered for its devotion to Scripture. There was no television, no entertainment radio, and little room for modern distractions. Prayer and the Bible shaped nearly every part of daily life. Years later, one detail still stood out. Before his prophetic ministry began, Wilkerson burned the only television in the house. To him, it marked a break from the secular world. To others, it revealed something unusual about him. By 14, he was already preaching. While most teenagers were trying to fit in, David was speaking about salvation. He later studied at Central Bible College in Missouri and was ordained in 1952. His first ministry was quiet and ordinary. A small church in Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania, a modest salary, and only a few dozen congregants. His life seemed destined to remain that way as a country pastor known only to his town. Then, one February night in 1958, a drawing in Life magazine changed everything. The Preacher Who Disrupted the Courtroom. In early 1958, Wilkerson was flipping through a copy of Life magazine when he stopped at a page inside. A charcoal sketch depicted 17 teenagers sitting in the defendant's box. They were on trial for the murder of Michael Farmer, a 15-year-old boy with polio who was beaten to death by members of the Egyptian Dragons gang in a New York City park. Something about that sketch wouldn't let him go. It wasn't just ordinary sympathy. It wasn't righteous anger. It was a visceral feeling, as if someone were calling his name from within the pages. A few weeks later, on February 28, 1958, he decided to do something that even he couldn't explain later. He got in his car and drove 350 miles from Pennsylvania to a New York City courthouse. Right in the middle of the trial, he stood up. He walked toward the front. He asked the judge for permission to speak with the defendants. The backlash was instantaneous. The judge, who had already received multiple death threats since the trial began, had zero patience for a rogue pastor. He ordered Wilkerson to be thrown out of the courtroom. The very next day, his face was plastered across New York's biggest newspapers. The headlines were scathing. Bible-toting pastor interrupts gang trial. In the photo, he looked bewildered, disoriented, and completely out of place in the big city. It was exactly the kind of notoriety no pastor ever wants. Anyone else would have packed their bags, driven back to Pennsylvania, and forgotten the whole ordeal. Back to the small flock. Back to a normal life. But Wilkerson did the exact opposite. 1,000 pieces will still love you. He returned to New York again and again, but this time he did not go to the courthouse. He went into the streets most people were afraid to enter. In late 1950s, Brooklyn and Harlem, Wilkerson preached to addicts, prostitutes, homeless teenagers, and gang members whom society had already written off. On freezing nights, he knelt beside children sleeping in cardboard boxes, praying for them while snow gathered on his shoulders. He lived on small church donations, yet often gave away what little he had. If a street kid needed a coat, he bought one. If an addict needed food, he sometimes skipped his own meal. During those early months, a gang member stabbed him. Instead of running, Wilkerson embraced the boy and kept telling him that God loved him. Word spread quickly. In a violent world, he became known as the preacher who would not run. Then he met Nicky Cruz, the feared leader of the Mau Maus. Cruz once threatened him with a knife, but Wilkerson answered with love instead of fear. That moment shook Cruz deeply. In July 1958, at St. Nicholas Arena, Cruz attended Wilkerson's rally with other gang members. That night, he broke down, gave his life to Christ, and many of his gang brothers followed. The teenager who once threatened Wilkerson later became one of America's best-known evangelists and a best-selling author. From the streets to Broadway. In 1960, Wilkerson opened the first Teen Challenge Center in Brooklyn. It gave addicts and street kids a place to sleep, eat, recover, and find a new path. Today, it has grown into one of the world's largest faith-based rehabilitation networks, with more than 1,400 centers in 129 countries. In his private office, he kept wooden boxes filled with thousands of letters. They came from former addicts, reunited families, and people who believed Teen Challenge had saved their lives. Many were stained with tears. To Wilkerson, they meant more than any award. But his work also made enemies. Stories from New York's ministry circles claim that mafia-run drug rings despised him for taking young people off the streets. Some said he received death threats, though the full truth was never proven. In 1963, Wilkerson told his story in The Cross and the Switchblade, written with John and Elizabeth Sherrill. The book became a Christian phenomenon, with sales estimates ranging from 15 million to 50 million copies. In 1970, Hollywood turned it into a film starring Pat Boone as Wilkerson and Eric Estrada as Nicky Cruz. In 1971, Wilkerson moved his headquarters to Lindale, Texas, and founded World Challenge. He left New York, but New York never left him. Then, in 1987, he walked through Times Square at midnight and saw drugs, prostitution, and broken young lives everywhere. The sight moved him to tears. Weeks later, he bought the Mark Hellinger Theater on Broadway for $17 million and turned it into Times Square Church. Within years, it drew 8,000 worshipers a week from more than 100 nationalities. The unknown pastor once thrown out of a New York courtroom had now bought a Broadway theater. The vision that turned America against him. Before going further, one myth needs to be corrected. Many videos call it David Wilkerson's 1965 prophecy, but that timeline is wrong. The real story began in April 1973. According to Wilkerson, he was praying alone in his Texas home when he received a disturbing vision. There were no witnesses, only his own account. He claimed to see 5 things: a global economic crisis, extreme weather, a wave of sexual corruption, a lost generation trapped in addiction and violence, and a future church weakened by compromise. In February 1974, he published those warnings in The Vision, with the chilling subtitle, A Terrifying Prophecy of Doomsday That Is Happening Now. The backlash was immediate. Religious leaders called him a false prophet. Others dismissed him as a fearmonger. Some Christian bookstores even removed his books, and stories spread of copies being burned during prayer meetings. Wilkerson later said he became an outcast almost overnight, but he refused to take anything back. He believed the vision would have to be judged by time and events. And then time began to pass. 50 years later, it all started making sense. Looking back at Wilkerson's 1973 predictions nearly 50 years later, some details still make skeptics uncomfortable. He warned of a financial crisis beginning in Europe before spreading into America. Decades later, the 2008 collapse followed a strikingly similar pattern as global markets froze, major U.S. companies crumbled, and gold prices soared. He also spoke about a future push toward a unified global currency, long before the euro even existed. His warnings about morality also drew attention over time. He predicted pornography would flood directly into homes, and that traditional social values would rapidly change. In the decades that followed, adult content moved from hidden stores to cable television, the internet, and smartphones. He also claimed churches would eventually ordain openly gay clergy, something that later became reality in several major denominations. In 1985, Wilkerson warned that famous televangelists involved in greed and sexual scandals would be publicly exposed. Within a few years, major scandals involving Jim Bakker and Jimmy Swaggart dominated national headlines. Another prediction seemed even more unlikely at the time. During the Cold War, Wilkerson believed Christianity would spread behind the Iron Curtain and inside Communist China. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Christianity grew rapidly across former Soviet states, while underground churches expanded throughout China. Then came the question that still surrounds his legacy today. Did he somehow foresee 9/11? In later editions of the Vision, Wilkerson added references to the attacks. Some followers insist he had spoken for years about towers collapsing in a major city, though no clear proof has ever fully settled the debate. The other side of the coin. But listing only the predictions that seemed accurate would not tell the whole story. Wilkerson also made warnings that failed badly. In 1992, he said New York City would be consumed by 1,000 fires the next year, with angry crowds in the streets, tanks on the avenues, and Broadway shut down. But 1993 passed without anything like that happening. In 1994, he predicted that every gospel television network would collapse within 5 years. By 1999, TBN, CBN, and Daystar were still operating and growing. In 2000, after a sharp stock market drop, he warned that a crash was unstoppable. 1 week later, the market reached a record high. In 1985, he predicted America would be destroyed by Soviet nuclear missiles. 6 years later, it was the Soviet Union that disappeared. Critics pointed to these failures as proof that he was not a true prophet. Norman Geisler argued that the biblical standard for prophecy was perfection, not occasional accuracy. Yet after his failed 2000 market warning, Wilkerson admitted he might have spoken from fear rather than from God. That honesty made him harder to dismiss. He was not as flawless as his followers believed, but not as fake as his critics claimed. Then came 2009, and the morning of April 27, 2011, when every debate about Wilkerson changed. The final warning before the clouds rolled in. On March 7, 2009, during the darkest point of the global financial crisis, Wilkerson published a short blog post that sounded like an alarm. He warned that a terrifying calamity was near, repeated his vision of 1,000 fires in New York City, predicted riots and looting in Times Square, and urged followers to store 30 days of food. The post spread fast. The Drudge Report featured it, and suddenly people far beyond his ministry were debating whether he was warning America or repeating old fears. John Piper, one of the leading evangelical voices of the time, openly doubted it, saying the warning felt too much like the panic surrounding Y2K. Then came the twist. 2 days later, on March 9, 2009, the stock market hit bottom and began the longest bull market in U.S. history. The fires never came. The riots never happened. Once again, the prophecy failed. But something inside Wilkerson seemed to change. Those close to him later said that in 2010, during prayer at his Texas home, he believed he had seen his own death. Afterward, he went downstairs, held his wife Gwen, and wept without explaining why. Weeks before the accident, he told her not to grieve if he died because he had lived a full life. In his final sermon at Times Square Church, he told the congregation he would not be there much longer. A few months later, he was gone. The crash no one could understand. On the morning of April 27, 2011, Wilkerson published a new blog post. The title was, "When All Means Fail." In that brief entry, he sent out a comforting message to those who were hurting. It contained a line that millions would later return to read with chills down their spines. It is not an accident. It is not a failure on your part. Hold fast. Let me embrace you in your hour of pain. Hours after hitting publish, at around 1 p.m., Wilkerson was driving his white Infiniti eastbound on U.S. Highway 175 near the Neches River Bridge outside Cuny, Texas. Gwen was in the passenger seat. Suddenly, the car veered into the oncoming lane. Heading straight toward them was an 18-wheeler driven by 38-year-old Frederick Braggs of Beaumont. They collided head-on. During the subsequent investigation, the Texas Department of Public Safety confirmed a detail that left many unsettled. Wilkerson was not wearing his seatbelt. His wife was. How could a man who strictly adhered to the Bible, who had driven hundreds of thousands of miles over his lifetime, forget the most basic safety rule on that fateful morning? Or did he know something he left unsaid? In later retellings, Frederick Braggs recalled a detail that would haunt him forever. In the final, terrifying fraction of a second before the impact, he looked straight into Wilkerson's eyes through the windshield. What he saw wasn't the blind panic of a man about to die. It was utter tranquility, as if he was ready. Wilkerson died at the scene at the age of 79. Gwen, saved by her seatbelt, was airlifted to the East Texas Medical Center in Tyler with a fractured hip and multiple injuries. She survived. But according to her children and grandchildren, she never truly came back from that day. A little over a year later, on July 5, 2012, she passed away from cancer at 81. People said her body simply couldn't bear to keep living without him. When news of Wilkerson's death reached Manhattan, a strange story began to circulate within the Times Square church community. Many congregants who were at the church that afternoon reported that right around the estimated time of his passing, an unnaturally strong gust of wind blew through the building. The windows rattled. The ceiling lights flickered. Yet, outside on the streets of Manhattan that day, the air was completely still. No one could ever verify the story, but no one who was there ever forgot it either. The man who cast no shadow on May 2, 2011, a private funeral was held in Tyler, Texas. Nicky Cruz, the former gang leader who once threatened Wilkerson with a switchblade, gave a tearful tribute. He said that without Wilkerson, his life would have ended in darkness. A public memorial followed on May 14th at Times Square Church. Thousands attended, while more than 1 million watched online in 10 languages. The night Wilkerson died, his name even reached the top 10 trending topics on Twitter. When asked what it was like living in his famous brother's shadow, Don Wilkerson said David cast no shadow. For many, it perfectly captured a man who lived for others without needing the spotlight. After his death, stories around him only grew. One claimed that when the news reached Times Square Church, a sudden wind and flickering lights shook the building at the exact moment he died. His legacy continued through Times Square Church, World Challenge, and Global Teen Challenge, which now reaches people through more than 1,400 centers worldwide. But myths also followed him. In 2020, a viral Facebook post falsely claimed Wilkerson had predicted a global pandemic in 1986. His family and Times Square Church denied it, and fact-checkers later confirmed the quote was fabricated. Still, the internet kept reviving his name. Through 2024, 2025, and 2026, TikTok and YouTube users continued rediscovering his real prophecies, often with one haunting claim. They mocked him in 1973, but now we are living in it. The open question. To this day, two sides continue to argue. One camp says his failed prophecies are concrete proof he didn't hear from God. The other side argues that humans only see in part, and even those spoken to by God are still just men. Wilkerson himself never claimed the title of a prophet. He always repeated the same phrase, "I am just a watchman. I see the enemy at the gate." Imagine for a moment, if Wilkerson were alive today, in 2026, looking at a world being rewritten by AI, overlapping wars in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and increasingly empty churches, what would he say? Would he be labeled a false prophet all over again? Or this time, would we listen? The final question is for you. What do you think David Wilkerson truly was? A prophet spoken to directly by God? A brilliant cultural trend reader who was sharp enough to make a few lucky guesses that aligned with history? Or something somewhere in between, a trembling man, desperately trying to warn a world that refused to listen? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because maybe, just maybe, the story of David Wilkerson isn't over yet. It's simply waiting for the next chapter. If you want to hear more untold stories about the people who changed the world in ways no one expected, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications.